Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Jacobo. We are so excited to welcome our keynote speaker this morning. Dr. Margaret Flowers is the Director of Popular Resistance and the host of Clearing the Fog Radio. She's on the Administrative Committee of the United National Antiwar Coalition and the Executive Committee of the U.S. Peace Council. She's also an organizer with the Sanctions Kill campaign. Flowers traveled on peace delegations to Iran and Venezuela in 2019, was an international election observer for the Venezuelan National Assembly election in December of 2020, and recently traveled to Nicaragua in March as a part of a delegation with Sanctions Kill. She co-founded the Embassy Protection Collective, which defended the Venezuelan Embassy in Washington, D.C. for 37 days in 2019, and subsequently was prosecuted by the federal government for that action. She's also on the board of the Backbone Campaign. A physician, Flowers has been active in advocating for a national improved Medicare for all and a wide variety of issues. We are so excited to host Margaret Flowers as our keynote speaker, the co-director of Popular Resistance, an online publication for movement news and resources. Welcome, Dr. Margaret Flowers.
Thank you, Grace. I appreciate that. And I'm going to try to stay to the 20 minutes that I've been asked to speak. So good morning to everyone. Thank you to Marsha Bernstein and Lizzie Turner for inviting me to be part of this conference today. And thank you to everyone who's showing up on what here in Baltimore, where I am, is a beautiful spring morning. So I guess, it was wonderful to hear the introductions, from Jacopo, particularly because a lot of the things that you mentioned, Jacopo, are things that I'm also thinking about in terms of the importance right now of organizing for peace and justice. Of course, it's always a good time to organize for peace and justice, but I agree that we really are facing, some very serious crises, both globally and in the United States. The pandemic has really continues to rage and threaten our health, and has really exposed the inequalities in the world, the US's aggression, as we see many countries around the world coming together to try to address the pandemic. The United States is playing a destructive role in that, and not being a cooperative member, of that kind of effort. The global, recession that we're facing, and 2020 we saw the global economy shrink. Now the pandemic was blamed for that, but of course we know that the footing of the global economy is a shaky footing, and economists have been predicting for a while that we were going to face a situation where we started to have stagnation and just kind of the global economy bumping along. And I think that's kind of where we are. We also see the world is changing in terms of the shifts in power, and the United States losing its dominance, globally, as we see other powers rising up and working together. And of course, the United States knows that. The Pentagon has done reports on the fact that the United States is losing primacy. But what is the prescription of the Pentagon in that situation is more investment in the war machine, more surveillance, more aggression, trying to hang on to that power rather than recognizing that we need to shift our whole way of doing things. I think that here in the United States, similarly, the pandemic and the recession have really exposed the systemic nature of the crises that we face in this country, and that we do in fact live in a failed state that has not been able to even meet the basic needs of its people economically, or for healthcare, housing, education, food, all of these things, protecting our workers. The United States is failing to do. I think about the analyst Alfred McCoy, who has predicted that the US empire will come to an end by the end of this decade. Which is coming quickly, actually. And so what is that going to look like? What is, as the world is changing and the United States is struggling, what's going to come out on the other side? And a lot of that depends on what we do as people, how we organize and how we work for change in our communities, in our states, in our country, globally. We really are, everyone are really the agents of, what is that future going to look like? And I think there's some positive signs, that I see, particularly that the conversations are changing in our country, that people are recognizing that this country was not founded on freedom and democracy, but was in fact founded on genocide and slavery, and that those institutions continue to impact the structures that exist today. And they've changed form, but it's still there. And so talking about how do we change that, and there are lots of good models that are out there around the world that we can look to for guidance and how we change. Also, I think that another point I just wanted to make is that for me, I feel a particular responsibility to be active because we are residents of a country that is an empire, and that is having an impact on so many countries around the world. And so we are really connected to so many struggles that are going on right now, because what we do here will impact what's going on in other places. I think of the attacks recently in Gaza, and and the US funding and support, political and both financial support for what's happening there. We have the power to impact our government and to try to stop that. And I'll mention some other opportunities that we have for change as I kind of go on through my talk. But all of this is to say that I think that this conference is really timely, that the topic is really timely. Learning more about organizing and honing our skills is always important. Meeting others in our community who are doing this work is really important. And so, and making the connections between the issues is also really important. So I've been asked to talk about my journey as an organizer, but again, before I get into that, I just wanted to share a few kind of thoughts on what is it that we're up against? What is this war machine that we are fighting right now? And if we don't understand what it is that we're fighting, it's hard for us to organize to change it. And so there's the obvious parts of the war machine. There's the military bases around the world, and the fact that the United States has 800 foreign military bases in 80 countries. We're continuing to build bases. I think right now, one of the most heinous ones is in the Galapagos Islands in Ecuador, a place, a protected place, and the United States is building a base there. There's also the bombs. We don't hear about this in the media, but the United States is continuing to drop bombs, and since the last 20 years, there's been an average of 46 bombs dropped per day by the United States, killing mostly civilians. But again, this is not something that we're talking about or you hear about in the media. I think about the drone program, which is continuing, and the whistleblower Daniel Hale, who exposed that drone program and is now in jail and facing sentencing for basically exposing an illegal program that, once he exposed it, went on to lead Congress to make some changes. But the drone assassination is continuing to go on. And I think about, just a little over a year ago, when the United States used drones to assassinate the general Qasem Soleimani of Iran, and at the same time, a commander in Iraq, sorry, I'm blanking on his name. Al-Muhandis was his last name, but, killing, extrajudicial killings of people, of an Iranian commander in a country, a country that we're not at war with, in another country. I mean, just the blatant violation of international law of that action is striking. But that, program is continuing and has killed 17,000 people in the last 10 years, that drone assassination program. And as Daniel Hale exposed, when they looked at the intelligence being used for that program, and over a 5-month period, 90% of the people killed were not the intentional targets. So it's an illegal program to begin with, but then, it's being used with a, faulty intelligence that's leading to these civilian murders. Another kind of weapon of war that we don't hear about enough is the unilateral coercive economic measures that the United States uses. We call them sanctions, but in reality, these are not sanctions. Technically, these are coercive economic measures put in place by the United States. There's no structure of, what these sanctions were intended to be was that, if a country violated certain laws, then there would be a judicial process, and then sanctions could be used as a punishment against that country. That's what the United Nations Charter outlines. But what the United States is doing is just basically using these to try to impact and weaken other countries for our own interests. And so these are a clear violation of international law. And they're impacting right now 39 countries and about a third of the world's population. And that's why we created the Sanctions Kill campaign, to try to educate people about the fact that these economic measures are just as deadly as conventional, bombs and other weapons. It's just that we don't see these deaths. We have people that are dying because they can't get enough food, or because they can't get the medications that they need. Or, if you look at Venezuela right now, an oil-rich country, it has the top oil reserves in the world, that has an oil shortage because of the economic blockade that's prevented it from being able to run its refineries and produce the oil. And so this impacts it impacts agriculture, being able to get the food to the markets. It impacts people being able to get to the hospital or get to work. So all of these, have an impact that's punishing the population. These are considered to be crimes against humanity. Again, we're not talking about this enough. And what countries are we impacting? Mostly countries in the global south. So looking at the racial aspects of these warfare tactics is also important. Also the information war. I think it's really critical that we understand that most of what we hear in the corporate media in the United States about countries that are being targeted by the United States is completely false. And that's why it's so important, I think, to travel to these countries and experience for yourself and see for yourself what's really going on. And the whole fallout from this information war, I think about China and the weaponization of COVID-19 and how that's been used to demonize China. And now, is there any surprise that we're seeing hate crimes, an increase in hate crimes against people of Asian descent? This is all related to the US's hybrid war of demonizing peoples to justify future aggression against them. The use of nonprofit organizations and building these opposition movements in other countries. So it's also important when we see uprisings in another country to think about what's behind that. And usually if you see members of Congress and the corporate media cheering on, protesters in another country, that's usually a sign that this is something connected to the US's interests, because we certainly don't see a lot of coverage of what's happening in Colombia right now and the severe repression against Colombian protesters, particularly youth, by the anti-riot squad in Colombia that's funded and trained by the United States. And then just finally, the use of international institutions like NATO, of course, a tool of US imperialism, but also the International Monetary Fund and using debt as a weapon, the World Trade Organization and the fight right now to end the patents on vaccines and medications for COVID-19, which, are impacting the fact that those patent protections are not being waived, impacts primarily global South countries. The United States domination of the United Nations and the World Health Organization, and how the WHO has been used, again, to demonize China. And what was Biden's first directive? We're going to, his COVID directive included a paragraph about how the United States was going to rejoin the WHO so it could lead it again. Well, what does that mean? It means that the United States is leading it for our own interests. So anyway, just, so much of this is in defiance of international law. And I think the day is going to come when the United States is going to be held to account for that. I hope that happens. I hope that we move to a world of respect for international law and diplomacy rather than warfare. I know I'm running out of time, so I do want to kind of talk about my own personal journey. And I just think it's important that each of us recognize that a life of activism is a journey, that is something that we are learning and changing over our lifetime. And don't be afraid to do that. Don't be afraid to take time to stop and figure out what's going on, or improve some skills if you feel like you need that in order to be an more effective activist. But for me, it came through healthcare, being a pediatrician and practicing clinical practice, and seeing that our healthcare system, like our war system, is a system for profit. It's not based on health. It was based on what corporations can get away with to charge high prices for insurance premiums, restrict payment out for care, and how this was having an impact on our patients' health, but also on physicians who are, not able to practice medicine in this country the way that they need to. And so I saw, many of my colleagues leaving practice, and myself I was getting frustrated with it as well. So I decided to go full-time to work on healthcare, and really spent a number of years learning health policy with Physicians for National Health Program. And then in 2009, 2010, when the health reform process was going on, I volunteered to be a congressional fellow, since I lived close to Washington, D.C. And that was a real eye-opening experience. I was down there almost every day, attending briefings and hearings, meeting with members of Congress and their staffers. And I just saw very up close and personal how the system works, how it is dominated by money, how it is the corporations that are writing the legislation, that are, there were, I think, 8 health lobbyists per member of Congress, and over $1 million a day being spent during that period to form a law that would further enrich these corporations. And so I saw through that how the typical traditional tools that we use for social change just aren't sufficient. And that was my entree to direct action as a tool, and to thinking more strategically about how do we actually impact, how do we affect change? How do we actually do that? As a physician, I wasn't interested in activism just because I wanted to be an activist. I wanted to actually have an impact. I want to actually change something. And so it was through that journey of when people would say, well, how are we going to win? That I started finding myself saying, well, we're going to win when we understand that the fight for healthcare is part of the broader struggle, and that we can't just be in silos. We have to link and connect our struggles, because we're more powerful that way, and because we're not going to just win the healthcare reform without winning the other pieces of the struggle. It's all very much connected, and we have to look at the roots of the crises that we're facing and address those. And so in 2011, it was actually December of 2010 when I first had a chance to make that connection publicly, as there was an anti-war protest being organized in front of the White House. And I said, may I be part of this and connect the struggle for health to the struggle for peace? And they agreed to let me do that. And then after that, a number of us activists from all around started talking about, well, what do we do next? And that's when we started organizing the occupation in Washington, D.C., which we started organizing in January of 2011. And by the time, it was something in the air. Everybody was talking about occupying public space, and it was during the fight struggles in Wisconsin where they took over the Capitol. It was at the same time as the Arab Spring that was going on. And so that was really in the air. And by the end of 2011, there was a full-blown Occupy movement going on. And out of that was when Popular Resistance, a few years later, was born out of that work. And our strategy is that it's not a new strategy. It's one that's been used forever. We called it Stop the Machine, Create a New World, because the way that we're going to win is by both resistance, stopping things that are harmful, but also creating the positive alternatives. So as you talk about in this conference, conflict resolution, you can't have the stopping the war machine unless you have something to replace it. Replacing it with respect for international law, replacing it with changing our practice. These are all very important. And so we are all about at Popular Resistance, not just movement news, but also organizing campaigns and looking for opportunities where we could have a direct intervention, where we could bring various movements together and work together for a change. And so one campaign that we waged for quite a while, more than 5 years, was stopping the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a trade agreement, but it was also the economic weapon being used by the Obama administration against China. And so, trying to encircle and isolate China economically through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And there were a number of reasons why that was also a bad thing, but we were able to organize and stop the Trans-Pacific Partnership from becoming ratified by the United States. Another opportunity was the Venezuelan Embassy, when the United States was attempted to conduct a coup in Venezuela, failed to conduct that coup, but then decided, which to me was a new level of whatever, to just act like we succeeded and say, okay, this person is the president, even though he was effectively not in any power, and start handing over Venezuela's assets to this particular person as if he were the president of Venezuela. And the main embassy in Washington, D.C. was one of those assets that they were going to hand over, which would then become a center for organizing the coup and giving it legitimacy. And so by being able to be inside the embassy and stopping them from taking it over, we were able to both expose what was going on and also, have an impact in stopping it. That embassy remains empty today as a result of that action. So just quickly, I want to say also the media. I know you're going to be talking about media next, but it's so critical that we develop our own media, because we can, when we work together, we can have an impact and change the narrative and start to actually hold the corporate media accountable as we educate people and they start to look less legitimate, as we're seeing now with the discussion about what's happening to Palestine. The corporate media is being forced to actually acknowledge that Israel is an apartheid entity. So all of this is to say that there's something for everyone to do, that find your passion, find what your skills are and apply them, and recognize that this is a lifetime of work and that there'll be times when you may be more active and may be less active. But if you're dedicated to peace and justice, it does become a way of life, and it's a really rewarding way of life. You meet wonderful people along the way. And, for me personally, I understand the gravity of the situation that we're in, but I also recognize that for me personally, the best way that I can live my life is by trying to do something to change it, and and be part of that wave, that historic wave that I hope to contribute to in my small way, so that we can one day create a world that is more just and peaceful. So thank you so much for inviting me to be with you today.